His first relationship was with a hot girl. 6 months later, she gave birth to his child. Being an honest man, he decided to take responsibility and married the girl. But after the wedding, he realized that the girl was too restless. As soon as the month was over, she left the baby with him and dressed up to go out. Finally, one day, he couldn't help but sneak up on her. When he walked into the bar with the baby in his arms, he realized that his wife was slutty. When he got home, he asked angrily. At this point, his wife stopped pretending. She just showed her cards and laughed at him for being a fool. Suddenly humiliated, he pushed his wife to the ground in a fit of rage. She was hit in the back of the head and died instantly. Just then, a drop of water fell on the woman's face. He then remembered that he forgot to turn off the bath water upstairs. He rushed upstairs, but it was too late. His 1-month-old child drowned in the bathtub. He was eventually convicted of intentional homicide and sent to prison. Years later, he kidnapped a boy from a supermarket and forced himself on his mother. On the way, he learned that the woman's name was Ruth and that she was a single mom. He demands to go to her house. Ruth was nervous and didn't know what Frank was up to. Fearing for her son's safety, she bypassed the police car. She didn't dare do anything, so she took the man back to her home. Fortunately, the man didn't mean them any harm, so Ruth was a little relieved. But when the news of the murderer's escape was broadcast on TV, Ruth realized that the man in front of her was a murderer on the loose. When confronted with the story, Frank simply explained that it wasn't true. He told the mother and son not to worry about him. He'd be gone by nightfall. They didn't think he was that bad, so they believed him. But harboring a fugitive is a serious crime, so to keep them out of trouble, Frank decided to do a little covering up. So with Ruth's consent, he actually tied her up. He was gentle. He didn't want to hurt Ruth. Ruth could feel how careful he was. She became more and more convinced that Frank would not hurt them. Then, as mother and son watched, Frank took out the ingredients and began to cook. When it was done, he served one to Harry and one to Ruth. He thoughtfully cooled the food and brought it to Ruth's lips. Ruth did not refuse. The little boy saw it, too. He knew his mother had been with a man for years after her divorce. It was a mental illness, but now, not a trace of disgust could be seen on his mother's face. It wasn't until late at night that Frank untied the rope. Due to the frequent police patrols in the neighborhood, he couldn't leave, so he stayed and waited for his chance. He spent the night on the couch in the living room. The next morning, Frank woke up early and prepared a hearty breakfast. During the conversation, he learned from Henry that his father was having an affair, so he divorced his mother. Frank complained about abandoning such a wonderful woman. At that moment, Ruth arrived. She offered to bring the rope and asked Frank to continue tying her up. Frank said no. He said he'd leave as soon as he could, but Ruth told him not to worry. No trains were coming through because it was a 2-day weekend, and then there was breakfast, which was surprisingly good. Frank realizes that Ruth is willing to continue to help him. So, to return the favor, he volunteered to do what he could. He repaired furniture, replaced old car fuses, and even cleaned his room. Afterwards, he would patiently teach Henry to play baseball with him. He was like a father, a family man. Now, he's experiencing a sense of home here like never before. He enjoys every moment here and everything he does. What he did made both mother and son unknowingly aware of his presence. Looking at Ruth mending her pants and comparing her to his slutty wife, Frank's heart swung. She never went out to play. She always thought of her family. What a wonderful woman she was. He couldn't help but inquire with concern about the scar on Ruth's knee. There was warmth in the air, when suddenly there was a sharp knock on the door. The atmosphere immediately became tense. Frank grabbed Ruth's neck from behind and told Henry to get rid of him. Henry did so. Luckily, it was just an old man from the neighborhood who came to deliver peaches. He warned them that there was a murderer in the neighborhood and not to go out. Henry was nervous, but managed to get rid of the neighbor without a hitch. Frank praised him for a job well done. Like a child praised by his father, Henry's face was beaming with joy, and Ruth could see it in her son's eyes. She knew that her son had always longed for a father like Frank. She didn't stop him, because Frank had revitalized the family. Looking at the basket full of peaches, Frank took them through the process of making his famous fruit bowl, leading them through every step. Like a family of 3, Ruth couldn't contain her excitement every time she touched Frank in the process. By the end, she couldn't stop shaking. Henry, too, saw something strange in his mother. He realized that she must be in love with this man. The baked peach cobbler was delicious, and the relationship between the two of them heated up quickly with the food. That night, Ruth snuggled up to Frank. Frank slowly put his hand on Ruth's waist. Ruth didn't refuse. She rested her head on Frank's shoulder. She enjoyed the moment and knew she was in love with him. She was in love with this man, and Frank was in love with this woman, until the patrol car drove by outside. It was a good time to leave. Frank said goodbye to them, but both mother and son couldn't let him go. When they asked him to stay, Frank stayed. maid. That night, having sex with Ruth, Henry happily accepted his new father. As if reborn, Frank took over all the dirty work in the house. He did his best as a father and husband. It taught Henry many life skills and gave Ruth the romance she deserved, except he couldn't walk down the street with them or stroll off into the sunset. He did the best he could, and because of him, Ruth, who had been alone for so many years, found the happiness she'd never known, and Henry realized how wonderful it was to have his father around. Because of him, the family was complete and full of happiness. Love made both of them younger. They wanted to be together forever. But Frank's status as a fugitive from justice could not be changed. Ruth didn't want to lose that happiness, and neither did Frank. They talked it over and decided to run away together to Canada. English was spoken there, and no visas were needed. They told Henry about their decision, and he agreed. The next day, they started to pack, but Henry suddenly ran away. He wanted to say goodbye to the girl he loved, but when she heard he was suddenly going to Canada, she skillfully guessed that the fugitive was in his house. In a panic, Henry confessed the secret, but he's sure she won't tell anyone, and the girl's last words give him pause. Across the room, Frank noticed that Ruth was in a panic. He reminds her that it's not too late to regret it. Ruth didn't hesitate to say that it was the least regrettable thing she'd ever done, but she's scared. She's had 5 miscarriages since giving birth to Henry. Not being able to have another child had made her depressed. She loved Frank and was afraid that she wouldn't be able to give him children. Upon hearing this, Frank reassured her that he didn't care. It's enough to have her and Henry around. That's what he really thinks. Ruth's condition stabilizes, but this escape doesn't go well. Early the next morning, Henry sneaks out again to deliver a farewell letter to his father, but on his way back, he happened to run into a police car on patrol. Seeing that he wasn't safe, the police insisted on taking him home. Henry had no choice but to get into the police car. When she saw Henry getting out of the police car, Ruth became nervous. The police also saw the luggage in her car. To cover up, she explained that she was going to sell groceries. The police didn't say anything, just made a token check and left. Upstairs, Frank also saw the scene and felt he couldn't put it off any longer, so he sent Ruth to the bank to withdraw the money and leave immediately. However, the large, one-time withdrawal was met with difficulty by the bank staff. Ruth was so nervous and incoherent that she made the bank staff a little suspicious. Luckily, with Henry's help, she gets by. However, Frank is bumped into by a female neighbor who pops in to deliver a pizza. It says he's a maintenance man, and the lady of the house is taking the kids to school. He's not sure if the neighbor knows him. Shortly after dropping off the hostess, mother and son return home. In this moment, every second they stayed, the danger increased and the time ticked away. Upon hearing his father's phone message, Henry insisted on returning the call. At that moment, the sound of sirens from all directions stopped them in their tracks. Ruth panics and tries to get Frank to run, but Frank realizes there is no way out and holds her tightly, telling her not to be afraid. He tied her up again so she wouldn't get involved, and then he said to her with great affection, "Maybe 20 years later, just to spend 3 more days with you." Frank said his final goodbyes and walked out of the room. No one knows how the police found him. All they know is that he got an extra 10 years for running away. Ruth went to a lawyer to try to defend Frank, but the lawyer told her it wouldn't work. She'd be charged with harboring. After that, she visited Frank in prison. She wrote to him many times but never received a reply. Frank wouldn't accept the visits or answer the letters. Ruth knew Frank wanted her to forget about him and move on with her life, but she never wanted to give up. Time flew by, and more than 20 years passed. Henry opened a bakery with a fruit plate that Frank had taught him to make. One day, he got a letter from prison. It was Frank. He was about to get out, so he wanted to hear from Henry to see if he could go to his mother. Henry was happy to oblige. He knew his mother had been waiting for Frank for over 20 years. They never left the old house. That way, when Frank got out, she could find him. After 25 years, they finally embraced again. This time, they would never be apart again. Some people can't fall in love with several people in one day. Some people can't spend their whole lives with one person. There's no right or wrong, just the hope of meeting the right person.